Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is SockBot, and today we are having another discussion type video that actually became the norm for a while there. But as you can tell, this is a different setting. You may have seen this before, but I apologize if the audio's off. It's just kind of how we're doing things today. But today I want to talk a lot about the different things that have been the hardest for me to personally get used to, but more importantly, the biggest changes, in my opinion, between creating in Little Big Planet and creating within Dreams. Now, I've talked a lot about this on this channel, but it's just become more and more apparent as I've learned the new tools how many things are just meant to be done differently within Dreams. Now, that's not to say that there aren't very Little Big Planet-esque ways of doing this, and that's kind of how I functioned for a long time, was basically finding workarounds for things that I didn't really know how to use yet, as I learned how to use them. Well, now I'm kind of there. Kind of, maybe a little bit, and so I want to talk about it. Again, this is only my opinion, and I'm only really going to talk about 4 big topics today, but feel free to leave anything that you think has changed significantly in the comments down below. Otherwise, I don't know, maybe this stuff was easy for you to get used to, but it certainly wasn't for me. I made videos about how difficult this was to get used to. But anyways, hope you're all doing well. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, but no pressure as always. Let's get right into the first big thing, which is gluing versus grouping. Now, these two things seemed very different to me to begin with. I thought that they were going to be completely different and that there was going to be some sort of gluing tool within Dreams. Now, obviously, this was all speculation because that doesn't exist. And in fact, grouping is the, well, I guess, impromptu replacement for gluing. Did I say that right? Grouping replaces gluing. Oh, it's been a long time since I've been on camera. But yeah, it's been a pretty big change, and I think that one of the things that I realized more recently when I've kind of posted about it with my last 2 tutorials was how important grouping can be to creating a contraption that works correctly. And I think that this is one of the concepts that's a lot harder to understand in Dreams than it was to understand in Little Big Planet. In Little Big Planet, it was pretty obvious. You stick 2 things together and then they function as if they're stuck together just like that. It makes sense. And then when they introduce things like the static versus the projectiles, the kind of setting that you could change within Little Big Planet 2, maybe it was only in 3. I know it was originally in Little Big Planet PSP and then they introduced in the console versions, but that switch still exists. It was more just the gluing part that has become so much different within Dreams. Now, I know this might seem like an obvious, topic to mention here. It's a completely different thing, but I think that one of the important things to point out here is that grouping introduces so much more flexibility with how your glued objects work. One of the things that I always hoped for within Little Big Planet was some sort of gluing and ungluing technology that would actually allow that to change throughout a level. Now, it's kind of awkward because that doesn't fully exist within Dreams. You can't really group and ungroup things with a switch, so far as I'm aware, but the point is that that's not really what I was looking for, and I realized that because within Dreams, you can create groups within groups within groups, which doesn't really sound useful until you realize that when you create a group, that group functions as its own world, and that anything that acts on that group as a whole functions and treats that group as its own singular object. So for example, in my most recent video when I talked about creating a fireball that jumps and also chases you, the reason that you have to create that sort of base for the jumping sphere on top of it is because that group needs to function as if it is a tall cylinder and it's following the player as that tall cylinder, and the animation within is honestly just for a visual effect and to show you where the fireball is in terms of how you're supposed to dodge it as a player. Now, I know that it sounds really complicated, and it is pretty complicated, but once you start treating groups as their own separate worlds and referencing them as such, you start to realize that when you're inside a group, there's a reason why you can set those shapes to movable or not movable, and then outside the group, the reason that you can set that entire group to movable or unmovable. When you're inside the group and you try to change something to movable, it only means that it's going to move in reference to everything within that group. So for example, if there are a sphere and a cube together within a group, and you make them both movable in that group, they can move wherever they want in reference to each other. But if you don't make them movable within that group and then you scope out and you make that whole group movable, the sphere and the square will kind of act as if they're glued. Now, that concept completely flew over my head for the first, I don't know, how long has it been? Well, until like 2 months ago. And so maybe it didn't fly over yours, but it completely did mine, and that's why I wanted to list it as one of the biggest changes. Now the next one might be a little obvious too. Maybe I should have switched the orders of this, but this has to do with animations because honestly, if you haven't worked with animations in the past and this is your first introduction, well, it's actually a pretty good introduction now that I think about it, but I do feel for anybody that has never worked with keyframes before, because even coming back to it after years of not working with any sort of animation, well, it's been a process. But one of the good things about Dreams and about these keyframes is that basically you can kind of work it however you want, but then people start to get a little confused when it comes to timeline keyframes and permanent keyframes. That's what I call keyframes that are not in the timeline. I know it's incorrect, but it's, alas, how I've labeled them. And the difference between this and the only animation and effects that we got within Little Big Planet, which was the sort of possess animation and or the kind of drag around the screen animation, is that with these sorts of animations we can completely replace all of the winches and the bolts and the pistons and a lot of the strings and various other physical contraptions that we got within Little Big Planet. Again, this kind of follows the same pattern as with gluing and grouping. It does a similar thing, and it also allows you to do a lot of things that perhaps you, and definitely me, wanted to do with these sorts of things, the winches and the pistons, and being able to disconnect them and connect them again, depending on what parts and what switches you hit. But we realized very quickly within Dreams, we being me, that that's not necessary now that we have all these sorts of animations. And being able to use these to do things like we used to do with winches and pistons just gives us so many more opportunities. Again, the only issue is that with more opportunities, it becomes more complicated. Animating things within a group is very different than animating a group, and animating things within a group can just create more complication on top of that. So I know that I'm kind of going with a theme here that Dreams is just innately more complicated, because I think in general it is, but at the same time, learning these things and learning it kind of in an independent sense, if you didn't play Little Big Planet, could actually be to, well, quite a few people's benefit, honestly, when it comes to learning how to do these things, because you don't have the struggle of trying to unlearn something at the same time. If you know how to do something, and you know how to do it with certain tools, and you're given different tools and asked to do the same thing, well, it makes sense that you'd have some experience and maybe be able to figure out how to use that tool to your benefit. But it can also be very confusing, and I think that that's one of the things that I've struggled with, and one of the things that I've tried to kind of put out here on this channel, that it's okay if you're struggling with that too. And sometimes I watch my own videos to remind myself of the same thing. And also, you know, because I'm clearly a gleaming narcissist. But second to last, and this is going to be a quick one, it's the sort of materials versus assets debate. It's not really a debate, but it's just the transition of going from all of these wonderful materials created by Media Molecule and given to us to use within our levels, to the difference of using people's assets online. It's a very different process when you go from having all these really cool materials and kind of figuring out what they look like to you, because a lot of the times they were kind of ambiguous for that reason, and then what you can build out of those things. Now, obviously we still have that. You can still sculpt yourself, but there's no equivalent to those sort of materials. Instead, we have sculpting from scratch and finished products. But I think that the in-between and what really replaces these materials to me is the community assets that you can then modify slightly to suit your own needs. I talk about this a lot in any of my creation videos when I'm talking through what I do for creation, because I'm not super artistic when it comes to sculpting. I don't have a lot of experience in like basic art from a bajillion art classes that I'm sure some people out there have taken, and I also just haven't spent the personal time to learn that depth of 3D sculpting. And I don't really need to, and it's not really something that interests me. What interests me more, and this is why I'm so glad that Media Molecule has encouraged this sort of gameplay, is taking other people's assets, just like I would take the materials in Little Big Planet, and modifying them slightly, but big enough to make them suit my needs and be unique enough to create a gameplay asset and part of a level that doesn't feel familiar. One of the easiest examples, and this is something that I've used a bunch of times because they just exist in so many different places and it's just such an obvious solution, is taking the bricks of a brick wall and turning them into a platforming segment. And this is super easy because all that you need to do is pull out any brick wall that you find on the Dreamiverse and just pull out the bricks within the group. It's a very easy way to modify something to suit your needs, but still use the aesthetic that you were given within your level. And I think that one of the things I was worried about initially was, if I use all of these different community assets, how am I going to create my own aesthetic for my own cohesive level? And I think sometimes I still struggle a little bit with that, and I know that I see a lot of people doing a great job of it and using all of these assets to make something completely unique to the point where I didn't even know they were using other people's assets. But I think in the end, you get to a point where, well, there's a line. Obviously, like in Little Big Planet, the materials, people are going to recognize those materials. In Dreams, perhaps someone's going to recognize one of your assets. But the important thing is that you use it and that you modify it, if you decide to modify it, in a way that is unique and that fits something that you're trying to portray to the gamer and that you're trying to create, and it fills this experience correctly without it seeming out of place. It's a very interesting balancing act that I am struggling with as well, but I think that, especially in one of my recent levels, I've gotten pretty good at it. All in all, the point is that is possible, and that it's actually not as difficult as you might think. But yeah, I think that's been an interesting transition. It's probably been more of the idea of switching from materials that you feel like you're creating all of those things yourself to assets, and the feeling that it doesn't quite feel like you're creating it all yourself. It feels less independent. Maybe that's the transition rather than the actual getting used to using these types of things. It's hard to explain. I mean, you can tell as I stutter through this point. But finally, and this is a tentative one, this is why I put it last, because I think this is more open to discussion, and this has to do with character creation. Now, obviously, you can create characters completely, well, almost completely from scratch, but basically you can create any sort of character you want, as we've seen on the Dreamiverse, from a bipedal creature to a cat to a car that acts like a character. It's all possible within Dreams. So obviously, yeah, that's a pretty big change from the quote-unquote character creation that we had within Little Big Planet, when you had to build something out of material and then create some kind of controlinator to control that, as would make sense. And that was a pretty simple process even then. But moving into Dreams, it is different, but it's also not. If you take exactly everything as it is, yes, obviously building a character from scratch is super complicated within Dreams, and so the only thing that you have to start with is the deluxe puppet, and nobody really wants to use that in their level, which is why I think a lot of people are so intimidated by Dreams, and why I was really intimidated by initially. I know the first thing I tried to do was character creation because I knew it was going to be so difficult, but since then I've kind of just realized that, as with a lot of other things, if you use a community character, it's very, very easy to customize that character, again, like I said with the whole material section, to make them unique, to fit your aesthetic, and to fit your level. But it's also really easy to add logic, and I think that the creating logic for these different characters and creating like a grab zone, which is something I did recently, so that when your character's holding something, that something has like a center of gravity to pull to. Creating those sorts of things does feel a lot like creating character modifications within Little Big Planet, which was actually super complicated, but it only seemed complicated initially because once you knew the setup steps, adding on to that was super easy. But you had to create like a remote microchip and like a remote controlinator that applied to the character itself and like all characters within range, and it applied to the character and it wasn't part of a SockBot, self-promotion, obviously, but it wasn't part of a SockBot. It was something that applied to the actual character. Creating all that was actually very easy once you got past the initial steps, and I don't quite know what it is. Maybe it's because you had the Sackboy to start with, and then you were able to make modifications to that, and that was actually pretty simple and made a lot of sense, and now you kind of have these community characters that you can then add on to. But one of the steps that's been like very significantly changed, and that it like kind of makes this part more undebatable, is the fact that you have all of these different chips within the character that you can modify and fine-tune so easily. And also, that gives so much depth and so much extra time that you can put into a character to make them so much more unique. And so it's one of those things where you kind of get out what you put in, but you also don't really have to put in that much to create a character that feels unique enough to make your game feel unique. And I know that that seems kind of like an oversimplification, especially if you've seen some of my streams. One of the things I praise the most is the few levels that have characters that truly feel incredibly unique. But I think that it's really not that difficult to get to that point. It requires a decent amount of, changing the different things within the character, making their jumps feel unique, but also feel good, and making sure that you can run and jump and everything just flows nicely and makes sense based on the obstacles that you've created. But you can just really go in there and change every aspect of the character. You can take a community character and add 50 different pieces of logic to the point where that character is unrecognizable to the creator of that character. I know that I've added quite a lot onto this little character that I've been working with recently, but well, hopefully you can still recognize him because his appearance hasn't changed much. He just has a few extra functions. Or she, I don't know. It's the dog, so it's kind of hard to tell the gender. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other changes I could mention. I can mention how the story is very different and kind of fulfills a very different part of the game than Little Big Planet's story. I could mention how the community and Dreams as a whole feels so much more ethereal and hard to pin down with a specific aesthetic. But obviously, I kind of see all these things as good things and kind of positive changes. And so it's not really worth it to go through each individual and say like, oh, this is so much different than what's in Little Big Planet. This video was more just to kind of point out the individual parts that I remember in Little Big Planet that I struggled to find within Dreams that I eventually figured out. Hopefully it helps you if you're transitioning from Little Big Planet to Dreams now that it is out in its full release and has been for a few months, but in addition, if anybody is intimidated by the create mode for these reasons, for reasons that I was intimidated by it, hopefully this can help you as well and kind of point you in the right direction towards what replaces what. If you do have any other questions or any other things that you kind of think are completely missing from Dreams or that I didn't mention here, feel free to leave a comment down below and feel free to, let me know what you guys thought of this video. Feel free to like the video, feel free to subscribe to the video, feel free to do whatever the heck you want, but no pressure as always. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you guys in the next video, but for now, goodbye everybody.